Teenage love can be exciting and adventurous, but for this young couple, they're about to find out that it can be super dangerous as well. What they thought would be an innocent hiking trip would cost one of them their lives, and a horrifying encounter with one of the most famous monsters to ever exist, La Llorona. I'm Felix Araujo, and I like to talk about the big 3 M's: monsters, mysteries, and the macabre. If you're also a fan of the big 3, please join the Monster Society and leave a like and review. Every like and review helps the pale man find his eyes. Now, for today's story. It's the 1980s, and a high schooler by the name of Jasmine is living in the Nevada desert. A lot of people don't get this about the desert, but it's not the heat that's dangerous. It's actually the water. You could be playing in the Araujo on a sunny day, not a cloud in the sky, when a rainstorm in the mountains sends your death hurtling your way faster than you can even react. Flash floods are no joke out there. That's why she always thought La Llorona was a popular tale for adults to tell children. It kept them away from the water. Jasmine always thought it was a pretty lame story all told, but it was a favorite of abuelitas everywhere. As children, she would often joke about the weeping woman, the ditch witch. But to the adults around her, she was no laughing matter. Her abuelita would often scold her, saying, "Mija, La Llorona is not to be trifled with. You will be sorry someday for your disrespect." She didn't believe her at the time, but she does now. Like many people, Jasmine's teenage years were spent in desperate scramble to be accepted by her peers, but it was largely unsuccessful. She sometimes made poor decisions due to her desire to fit in. The poorest decision she ever made was because of Brian Allen. Brian Allen moved to her small town from Washington State. That alone would have made him a desired commodity, as they didn't get too many new kids. Pair his exciting newness with his immaculate brunette hair and a flawless white smile, and most of the girls in her school were completely smitten. She didn't know if she liked like Brian, or if it was just the competitive streak that ran in her blood. But she knew as soon as he came through the doors of their tiny school that she had to impress him. She felt she wouldn't do it based on her looks, but thought that maybe she could win him over with her adventurous spirit. So she devised a plan. Kinda. It wasn't so much of a plan as an excuse to be alone with him. See, what she thought to do was invite Brian on a group hiking trip. One so remote that he'd have no choice but to get to know her. Jasmine would impress him with her knowledge of local flora and fauna, and show off her outdoor skills in the process. She thought boys from the Pacific Northwest would like that kind of thing, and also everyone else in the group would cancel at last minute. It would just be her and Brian. Much to Jasmine's surprise, Brian accepted her invitation and seemed genuinely excited about the prospect. He'd never been out in the desert, he said, and he would love to go hiking with someone who knew the area. She tamped down the shearing voices in her head and answered him with a simple, "Cool, I'll pick you up on Saturday morning." She knew the perfect place to take Brian, a shady little section of the forest that transitioned to wide open canyons. It was on private property, but that never stopped anybody she knew from setting out on it. When Saturday morning came, Jasmine could barely contain herself. She gassed up her old beat-up Chevy truck and sped all the way to Brian's house. He was waiting outside of his door, comically overdressed in hiking boots, a long-sleeved shirt, and a wide bride safari hat. He was confused when he just saw Jasmine. She shrugged her shoulders half-heartedly at him and explained the increasingly elaborate excuses for why her companions had not been able to join them. He didn't seem to care though, and gladly hopped into her truck. Brian was talkative and animated as they drove to their destination. It appeared as if she had guessed right, and he was indeed an outdoorsman of some enthusiasm. He paused his stream of excited conversation as they pulled off to the main road and onto the rugged dirt trail. A sign read, "Caution, high clearance vehicles only." He stopped speaking entirely when they passed the rusted sign, and he began to read it out loud. "Cutthroat Canyon, private property. Violators will be shot." Brian looked at her worried and asked, "Are you sure we should be here?" She grinned at him and said, "Well, it'll definitely be exciting." Brian made a move to speak again, but she was already outside the truck. She was right about the destination though. It was perfect. Brian's worries began to fade as they walked through the strands of cottonwood that lined the small river. He was downright content that they walked through this beautiful forest. By the time they reached the canyon, he was absolutely elated. "This is incredible," Brian shouted at the open wilderness around him and gave Jasmine a bright smile. The day couldn't have been more perfect. Bright blue skies dipped down to meet the canyon walls, and though the late August temperature was hot, it was not uncomfortably so. They walked over the rocks as they explored the bottom of the canyon. Brian would let out woos of surprise and delight at the roadrunners and lizards that darted among the ground around them. As the day headed into early afternoon, she began to detect a change in the weather. The temperature rose high at first, and then really slow dark clouds gathered around the edge of the canyon, turning the blue skies to a foreboding gray. "Let's move to a higher ground for our walk back," she said, trying her best to sound nonchalant. Brian gratefully agreed as she could see beads of sweat around his brow as he drank from his nearly empty bottle of water. He wouldn't admit it, but she could tell that he was eager to head back to the air-conditioned truck. They climbed steadily out of the canyon, and from their new vantage point, she could see that the clouds were becoming a much bigger deal. Lightning flashed across the distant mountains as a shiver rolled up her skin. They were very near the forest when she felt the first rain. The water fell in cold, fat drops, and she found herself wishing that she had brought more clothes. In the distance, she could see a school bus that was half buried in the desert sand. Though it was rusted out and fallen apart, it would be a great place to wait out the rain. Jasmine grabbed Brian's hand and ran for the bus, dodging raindrops as they went. They huddled together in the seat towards the back of the bus. She assured Brian that rain faded quickly out here and there was nothing to worry about. Meanwhile, she tried to ignore the sounds of distant thunder and the increasingly loud roar of water in the canyon. A flood had come, and she had serious doubts about her ability to walk out of Cutthroat Canyon. The bus creaked and groaned as the water washed away dirt from beneath its flat tires. They held on for as long as they could, but eventually they had to leave the bus to wash away into the newborn river below them. They were stuck in the rain. The river had become too high to cross back to Jasmine's truck, and the canyon was impassable, filled nearly to its rim with brown-orange water. They trudged unhappily to the nearest tree and hoped that lightning wouldn't get them. That's where they were when night fell. The rain had stopped, but the river and the canyon remained swollen, forceful barriers. She hoped that she would be dry enough to sleep through the night without freezing. She thought the cold would be their biggest challenge. Brian had tried his best to remain upbeat. His constant stream of conversation, though slower than the river, still flowed on. They bonded over childhood television shows and memories of sleepaway camp and told stories of their weird families. That's probably why she didn't immediately notice when Brian said, "Hey, who's that lady?" It took a second for her to register what he had said. Lady? There shouldn't be a lady out here. Her eyes followed his outstretched arm to the place where he was pointing. That's when she saw her. La Llorona. She stood completely still next to the water. Not even her long white gown moved in the wind. From a distance, probably close to 50 yards, she couldn't make out the details, but Jasmine knew it was her. She was wrapped from head to toe in white. Dark hair framed her pale face, and a long neck led to a skinny body. "She'll fall in the river," Brian shouted and bolted up. Jasmine reached out to grab him to pull him back to safety, but he was already running towards her. Jasmine followed, against every instinct screaming in her body. La Llorona had her arms outstretched, and as Jasmine moved closer, she could see her more clearly. She was beautiful. Her eyes were large and dark, yet comforting. Her lips were full red and unsmiling. She parted them slowly as a voice escaped them. "Mi hijo, ven a mí, mi hijo." Jasmine knew that Brian could not understand the words, but still he moved towards her. Jasmine shouted at him to stop, to come back, but he was focused on no one but her. Jasmine put her hand on his shoulder and he shook it away, not even turning to look at her. The reedy voice continued, "Sí, sí, mi hijo." Then La Llorona began to wail. Jasmine stopped in her tracks, daring to go no further, as Brian moved trance-like towards her. When he at last stood face to face with La Llorona, she tilted her head to look at him. A frail hand cupped his face and she smiled sadly. She moved in closer and kissed his forehead, much the way a mother would, all while wrapping his hands around his neck. Jasmine never heard Brian scream, never saw him resist. He slumped limply against La Llorona's hand while she kissed each one of his bloodless cheeks. With the grace of a dancer, she flung Brian's lifeless body onto the torrent below. Jasmine could hear him splash in the water, and she thought just for a second that she could hear him gasp for air. Jasmine is ashamed to say that she ran. She ran until her feet bled and her lungs seared with pain. She collapsed under a tree and slept until the first light of the morning. The flood had died down the next day, but she didn't see Brian's body in its empty trenches. They wouldn't find it for weeks, despite the water only flowing in one direction. He'd eventually wind up miles down the Rio Grande. She told the authorities that he drowned, that the flash flood had caught them off guard. She doesn't know if his parents blamed her, but at his funeral, they wouldn't even look at Jasmine. No one would. People in the town seem to believe that she was responsible, but she knows the truth. La Llorona took Brian. She took him as a bargaining chip in a deal that would never be made. So that's gonna do it, guys. If you guys have any experiences with La Llorona, I would love to hear them. You can find my email on the description. And if you did like this story, please don't forget to help this channel by leaving a like and review. Let's help the pale man find his eyes. Till next time.